Hi, I'm Mark, and welcome to the hippest tour in Svalbard. I call it that because in recent months I've broken not one but two hips, and so that explains the crutches and why I'll be using them during this tour today. I expect it will last about 90 minutes, and as all my tours are, they're completely improvised, what I talk about. They're all based on my experiences here during the last 10 years as the editor of Ice People, the world's northernmost alternative newspaper. And as with my newspaper, this tour will cover a lot of things you'll never hear about, from so-called normal guides, normal tours, normal news coverage. And I will try to answer questions people have if they want to submit them online. In this case, since this is a video, I will always try to answer. I can't always promise the answers will be completely accurate, but I'll let you know if they're nonsense. Anyhow, we're going to start this off in this town square where this statue of a miner is a tribute to this town's historic industry, which has now mostly shut down. It's also the gathering place for a number of community events, everything from May Day speeches to the lighting of the Christmas tree here. And we've had other events happen, such as last year the world's northernmost March for Science occurred here. A bunch of folks gathered in the square and talked about how they didn't like things like fake news and the worries about misleading facts on climate change and all that. The interesting thing about it is one of the people in that crowd claimed to have participated in the world's northernmost march at the North Pole and posted it on Facebook. But of course she wasn't there because I had pictures of her here in town. So you had a fake news protest getting attention from somebody who was making their own fake news. Okay, if you look up on that mountainside there, you'll see some snow barriers that are being built right now. And the reason for that is back in December of 2015, we had a large avalanche that destroyed 11 homes at the base of that mountain. And then in February of 2017, we had another avalanche that took out two apartment buildings basically the next block down. And they did some studies, and while they've known the risk of avalanches can exist, and that's been known for a couple decades now, but they did some new studies after that second avalanche, and what they determined was that due to climate change, our patterns of snow accumulation, the amount of snow we get, the number of extreme storms, all of that is increasing. And as a result, the knowledge base we had about avalanche dangers here is no longer valid. They have to build a completely new model. And because of that, they decided all those homes at the base of the mountain that are still standing, they can't be occupied when there's any snow on the mountains. And so half the year they're empty. That's about 60 homes, and not only is it a tremendous aggravation to the folks who own those homes, but it's also contributed to an extreme housing shortage in this town. So the government has allocated a great deal of money for emergency housing, but they've also allocated a great deal of money to build those barriers in the hope they'll be up by this coming winter and maybe allow folks to return to those homes. When we've had these avalanches I've mentioned, as well as some other concerns, or even alerts, they've evacuated quite a few homes. At one point it was more than 100 for a particular storm. When that happens, this Culture Reset, which was built as a performing arts center and opened in 2009, this becomes the evacuation center. This is where people gather, they sign out they let folks know that they're no longer in the homes. They sign it from there. They get food and they'll get housing assignments. And next to it is the youth center. When we've had disasters, this becomes the crisis center for family members and others close to those who are injured or killed. So this is a little bit of emergency row. As you can see in the top of the mountains there, the snow is starting to come back already. The first day of school was yesterday, and that coincided roughly with the first snowfall in the mountains. So within a couple months, it's possible they'll have to empty those homes out again. Now, an amusing bit of trivia is if you look over to this mountain there, you'll see what looks like a wine glass with part of the stem missing. That is Opperfjellet, a mountain that is known because Norway's deadliest plane crash occurred there. It was a plane carrying a bunch of folks on their way to work in the Russian settlement of Pyramiden back in the 70s, and everyone on board the plane was killed, and that set off a chain reaction that resulted in the complete shutdown of the settlement within a few months. The settlement had been struggling for some time, and that was just really the final blow. And that was the loss of a huge mining community. As I said, mining's winding down here, but they are trying to make a go of it in other ways here with tourism, and much of that relies on some of the old mining structure. One of those structures is these trestles you see here that are coming down the chain off the mountain. And if you look at the base of them, you'll see that there's some very thick wood posts essentially anchoring them. And the reason for that is, as climate change has taken hold here and the permafrost has softened and these structures have aged, there's concern that they're unstable and they could top over in a storm. In fact, that concern was so acute that they decided not to open a ski hill near the school last year because the ski path ran right between two of those trestles and they didn't want kids exposed to that danger. So they're reinforcing these so that they can remain here. They're doing a lot of other similar work with mining infrastructure, rehabilitating mines that are too damaged to enter now, but they hope eventually they might be turned into tourist facilities, as they've already done with Mine 3 on the edge of town. All right, now we're going to continue on. And this is Longyearbyen Hospital, which is where I have been for both of my surgeries. This is where I went to the emergency room twice, both times recently when I broke my hip. But to actually get the surgery, they had to take me to the mainland on an air ambulance because this hospital has limited facilities. And for that reason, that's why, as you may have heard, pregnant women are forced to go to the mainland a few weeks before their due date because this hospital isn't really equipped for complications. And many other treatments also have to go down there. Now, this requirement for pregnant women is why you sometimes hear this inaccurate myth that Longyearbyen is the town where you cannot be born and you cannot die. Well, of course you can be born here. If somebody goes into labor here, they'll deliver the kid. And there's certainly plenty of people who have died here for natural or other causes. What you cannot do is bury a body in the cemetery, for example, because it wouldn't stay that way. Now, they have continued to bury people's ashes at the cemetery on occasion over the years, and the governor several years ago gave permission for people to start spreading their ashes if they wanted here, and that's happened on a couple of occasions as well. Now, across the street from the hospital, we have one of two kindergartens that exist in Longyearbyen. There used to be 3 kindergartens, but one of them closed because we lost a lot of families when the large coal mines here shut down, and so now there aren't enough kids to justify 3 of these. An interesting thing about the kindergartens is they're one of the spaces where some of the most complaints about tourism behavior has occurred in recent years. They say a lot of people just wander into these kindergartens wanting to see the kids or wanting to use the bathroom. They'll just walk through like it's an open-air park, and they've had to issue some strict instructions not to do that. I also read something about 5 years ago that said one of the first things kids here learn to say in English is no photos. Now, I can't verify that myself, but that's the rumor. And there was an occasion at the other kindergarten here where a passenger from a cruise ship was walking past, saw these kids telling him not to take photos. He walked over to this fence, dropped his drawers, and peed on the fence where these kids were. Now, this is one of those many inexplicable incidents that we've had in recent years. We've had people come home and find tourists in there wandering around their homes just to see how the locals live or rifling through their cars. Unfortunately, we've also had a number of thefts, which is why they put in security cameras at the store a few years ago. One of the more bizarre things I saw this summer was they have a stuffed polar bear in the town square, or near a gift shop in the town square, and there's a sign on it saying "Don't touch it." And I spent one day just watching for several minutes as a non-stop string of tourists came along, pushed the sign out of the way so they could get photos themselves hugging the bear. These are the things that some efforts are being made now to spread awareness about responsible behavior here. In fact, a great deal of money is also being spent to enact more environmentally responsible policies with cruise ships that come here. This year they got rid of single-use plastics on a lot of ships, and it took a lot of other steps to reduce their impact. Even so, these ships do have an enormous amount of impact in terms of air pollution that they can cause, in terms of the number of people who just leave footprints all over the landscape, and of course litter and other damage that they've caused. This is the Radisson Hotel, one of several full-service hotels here in town, one with a brand name. It's also, on a rare occasion, the local courthouse. They turn the conference room into the courthouse, and we don't have a lot of trials here, but I can only think of two actually in the 10 years I've been here. But they certainly can be interesting, as with anything that happens up here. The most recent trial we had involved a French explorer who was planning to sail up here during the fall and then go all the way up north to the edge of the ice sheet and then take dog sleds to the North Pole and then come back and bring a ship out of the ice when spring came in a basically following the footsteps of one of the classic explorers from more than a century ago. Now, unfortunately, what this guy did was he took his boat into areas of Svalbard that you're not allowed to travel in, and he also brought some dogs with him and brought them ashore, and he didn't have a permit to do that either. So these were very serious no-nos. Now, he got himself all the way up to the northeast edge of Svalbard, where he ran into some very bad weather, and the storm damaged his boat. And so he calls up the governor's office and says, "Hey, look, I still want to continue my expedition during the spring. I just need to have somebody bring some parts up here so I can fix my boat. Do you mind if I stay here this winter and just kind of hang out?" And the governor's like, "No, there is no way we're going to let you do this." So they went up and they retrieved him and his boat, brought him back to town, and he was then put on trial the following spring, and he was obviously found guilty of a number of things. He was hit with a 35,000 kroner fine, so that'll give you a sense of scale compared to the other crimes and incidents I've told you about. Now, the interesting thing was, this was a very respected explorer. But he kind of lost it a little bit once he got arrested. He felt the Svalbard Environmental Protection Act allowed equal access to anywhere for anyone. And when that didn't happen, he started accusing the Norwegian government, the French government, the media, and a number of others of various conspiracies. And he built up an enormous social media following for that. And while it was entertaining, it was also extremely misleading. And we have a lot of that happen. A lot of folks have a lot of misperceptions about Svalbard. And I'll try to correct some of those, as with the "you can't live and die here" thing, as I mentioned earlier. So I've spoken of myths and false perceptions about Svalbard and Longyearbyen. One of them is the assertion that there are more polar bears than people in Svalbard. That is not true. Svalbard has about 2,600 people, and according to a recent census conducted by the Norwegian Polar Institute, there's roughly 900 to 1,000 polar bears. Now, there are 2,500 to 3,000 polar bears in the entire Barents region, which includes Norway and Russia, but that's clearly much different than just Svalbard. Now, what there are more of than people are snowmobiles. These are more practical form of transportation than cars for many reasons, not the least of which is we only have 42 kilometers of roads. Most of that is a dirt road going out to the mine and some other areas, as well as a road that goes to the airport and some cabins. But you can go all over the place by snowmobile, and during peak season in the spring, these areas in the valley here and elsewhere, they end up looking more like a freeway than a pristine wilderness valley. And in recent years, tourism has really developed as a commercial activity to replace mining. And as such, you're seeing more and more snowmobiles out there. It's a concern for some people because of their impact in terms of noise and pollution. And there is an effort to keep some areas free of these vehicles, at least to the large commercial tours. Now, another interesting aspect about this is that means we also have these big snowmobile parking lots all over town. And some locals have said they feel like this is an eyesore, that maybe we should have some central locations where we can just put all the snowmobiles in one place instead of just having them in backyards like so many used or junked cars. Now, when I poll visitors on that, I get almost a 50-50 response in terms of those who think this is ugly and those who find it kind of a cool and unique aspect of this town. Now, so this neighborhood is where the most recent occurrence of the polar bear actually wandering into Longyearbyen occurred. It was January of last year, and it was about 5 in the morning, and the bear, along with a cub, wandered past the dog kennels at the edge of town, and past the university and a snowmobile shop that's down there, and then went along a neighborhood street at the bottom of the hill here. And because of the early morning hour, of course, nobody noticed it until it was actually in that neighborhood. Somebody saw it from a kitchen window and then proceeded to follow the bear with their car and notified authorities. But clearly, had somebody been outside at that hour because of the darkness, there would have been a tremendously dangerous situation. And so when people ask, is the threat of polar bears here real? Do you really need to carry a gun if you leave town, and so on? I tell them it doesn't happen often close to the city itself, but it's always a possibility. You always have to take it seriously, and despite the fact many visitors don't want to let the rules apply to them, they have to. An interesting story that happened with somebody who didn't think the rules applied happened a couple of years ago when he came here and decided he wanted to walk unarmed to Icefield Radio. That is a place about 80 kilometers from here. To get there, you would walk 60 kilometers to the Russian settlement of Barentsburg to the east of here, and then go a bit beyond that to the peninsula where this place called Icefield Radio is. It's now essentially a overnight lodge, but in the past has been a weather research station. Anyhow, he got there, and the staff there they were astonished. They couldn't believe he was there, but they also couldn't keep him there because they don't have that authority. They would have been kidnapping him if they prohibited to leave. What they did do was call the governor, who went out in a rescue helicopter for this person, and he was very shocked when they arrived, of course. He was not happy to be brought back. But what also was shocking was the governor decided not to fine him, not to filing criminal charges. They just let him go on his way. And that upset a lot of people here because, one, that's an expensive rescue operation. And two, what kind of message does it send when you don't hold somebody responsible for an act like that? This building is the University Center in Svalbard. It's also where Svalbard Museum is, and the Svalbard Research Park. The university is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, and unlike a lot of universities, this one's a little more limited. It focuses on Arctic science, biology, geology, technology, and geography. Now, a great deal of climate research happens here. This is, in fact, maybe as good a spot to do this kind of research as there is on Earth, because climate change is occurring twice as fast in the Arctic, and specifically here, as the rest of the world. So we're getting a very good preview of the impacts some others are going to be feeling soon. Also, the conditions we have here often affect what's happening in the rest of the planet. When we have warm spells, a lot of that cold air gets driven to the south, which is why Europe's had some very, very cold winters lately, because in Longyearbyen we just finished having our 90th straight month of above average temperatures. And that has meant we've had rain during the winter, which almost never used to happen, certainly not in December and January. The ice, which used to freeze solid every year, has not done so in West Svalbard in recent years. And the ground has become soft, which has put a lot of structures that are not on foundations specifically built to cope with that to be endangered. So an interesting bit of news that happened here was as part of the 25th anniversary celebration that's going on this year, the entire royal family came by here last weekend for a visit. And during that visit, Queen Sonia presented a photographic artwork to the university she took out of an ice cave, and then she had some help from some artists who then touched it up to give it more light and vibrance. And that's one of several art projects she's done up here. She had another one where she did a series of works that translates into English to 3 visits, 3 landscapes. And those are from trips dating back a decade. And she's also made other contributions. We had an art residency program that started here a couple of years ago. She came up for the beginning of that, and during it donated a very large artistic printing press. So she's been very active in that work. Now, a bit of fun about the royal family's visit is when they got here, they met with the governor, because the governor often meets with visiting dignitaries. And while there was an exchange of gifts, it was not a usual gift for the royal family. The governor gave the family trash bags, and then the family took those trash bags and used them to clean up trash on shore where they stopped their boat during their week-long vacation here. And this is another issue that has become very, very big in terms of environmental awareness. We have an enormous amount of trash on many of the shores here, and the governor has hosted annual cleanup trips for quite a while now. But now cleanup efforts are being done by environmental organizations, by commercial cruise lines, and many others. There are, in fact, you can do it as a discounted cruise if you agree to spend half your time during it picking up trash. There'll be a day-long cleanup for local volunteers this weekend, where they'll go out to some of the beaches in Isefjorden, and they've had, I believe, more than a dozen of those these past 2 summers. And they're also doing a great deal of study of this trash, where it comes from, how much of it there is. And what they're finding is, while you see a lot of fishing gear and all that, they're discovering that an enormous amount of trash is making its way here from municipal and settled areas in Europe and North America and so on. And that there are a number of large garbage patches throughout the world, and they believe that another very large one is forming outside the waters of Svalbard. And even though they'll claim these beaches, it takes 6 years or less for the same amount of trash to return to those shores. So we're going to have to keep coming back to those over and over and over, probably indefinitely, no matter how much effort is made to reduce plastic use and waste in the oceans. So this is the intersection where cruise ship passengers typically take a right and head into the center of town to do their shopping or to look at other things. But I strongly encourage people who are looking for something a little bit different to do, especially those interested in a hike, since they can't go into the mountains without a rifle. I strongly suggest they walk towards the edge of town where the dog kennels are, and then go down to the beach and just take a walk along that, because you see a number of very, very unique and interesting structures down there. A lot of diversity too. There's a museum not a lot of people know about that focuses on North Pole expeditions. There's an international research station that exists there, some guiding things. There's also everything from very old houses, traditional miner style, to literally just little mini houses, the kind of things that are becoming trendy in some places around the world. And it looks like the place was designed with no master plan zoning because, well, more or less it was. Things just kind of popped up that way. But there also can be a lot of other interesting things to see. There's a group of kayakers out there right now. Also see a large group of birds, and not exactly certain what's attracting them, but it's always possible that there's a whale out there. There have been a number of whale sightings in town this summer, and by a number I mean more than usual. There was a carcass washed up on a beach just outside of town where a polar bear was seen feasting on it for a few days. So there can be quite a bit of unusual activity. You can also look across the channel and see some cabins there. Those are from some of Longyearby's earliest mining activity, as are cabins and other structures that go all the way around the corner of the bay there. And this occurred back around the turn of the 20th century, when the mining activity here kind of began as a free-for-all. A lot of prospectors coming up here trying to start up companies, and only two ended up surviving in Longyearbyen and past the initial stage, one of which was based out there and didn't make it past the 1920s. The other, of course, was Store Norsk, which continues to operate today on a limited basis. They have one remaining mine about 10 kilometers outside town along this road. Now, the other thing that's interesting along here is people who walk into town walk past these buildings and probably think they're just very ugly metal shacks, but there's a lot of very interesting and very important things going on in there, especially as we turn to a post-coal economy. So I'll tell you about that as we go. So, coming up here, we have one of our many polar bear statues, exhibits, other, how would you put it, sculptures. This one's fairly unique, and as you can tell from the sign, it belongs to a local film producer named Jason Roberts. He has been involved in some very well-known productions, including the Frozen Planet series from about 5 years ago. He also worked with a number of commercial film crews on releases. He also did the Fortitude TV show for its third season when they came up here and filmed this spring. And so while his name may not be known, his works certainly are. He does, however, have one infamous moment. He did a documentary called The Polar Bear Family and Me, where he had maybe his most famous viral moment online occurred when he went out with a narrator, a British narrator, who was put into a polar bear proof cage. we'll have to deal with this a few times as we go on this road. In fact, another one's coming, so I'm just going to stop talking and let it pass. This is proof that coal mining is not completely dead here. So that's, while it's ugly, it's also a good sign for the economy. Anyhow, he went out with this narrator and put him in a polar bear proof cage, waited for a polar bear to come along and start rattling the cage while the person inside it talked about the experience. It was remarkable footage, and it went completely viral on the internet. The problem was it was also completely illegal, and there's a massive violation of the Environmental Protection Act, which says you cannot act in a way that disrupts wildlife or their behaviors. So Jason ended up getting fined 50,000 kroner, and that is the largest fine I'm aware of since I've been here for an individual offense. Again, giving you a sense of scale of how offenders are handled. So now we'll walk into town and take a look at some of these new businesses that are popping up to replace coal mining that are in unexpected places doing things you wouldn't expect to necessarily be taking place here. And speaking of automobiles, behind me is the world's northernmost gas station and the world's northernmost car dealership. We used to have two car dealerships up here. The other one sold Subarus and, for whatever reason, Suzukis. But they decided to focus strictly on snowmobiles a few years ago. So now it's just this place. And they are going to try something new beginning this fall where they're going to do essentially car sharing, so that not everybody who wants access to a car has to buy one up here. Now, in Svalbard, owning a car is a lot easier than on the mainland. On the mainland, they charge some immense extra taxes and fees, but a car that might go for, say, $600,000-700,000 on the mainland would probably go for about $250,000-300,000 up here. And of course, if you buy one here and then bring it down to the mainland to register it, you got to pay all those extra fees. And that's the same with a number of things here. Svalbard does not have the 25% value-added tax that exists for goods on the mainland. So buying everything from computers to food can be cheaper here. Of course, the longer shipping distance means a lot of items cost a lot. One thing that's much, much cheaper here, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is alcohol. So people who come up here, they often tend to try to buy a lot of that if they're allowed to. But there are some strict limits. And if you're not aware of those limits, you're essentially allowed to buy a case of beer and one bottle of hard liquor every month, and there's a ration card for that. You're allowed to buy unlimited amounts of wine, and as I understand it, the reason for this is when these laws were enacted, they were figuring the working miners were the ones buying the beer and hard liquor, but it was the management making the decisions who were drinking wine, and therefore decided they didn't want to have any limits put on that. Okay. To my left is the administrative headquarters of Store Norsk, which was the cornerstone company of Longyearbyen, and it just celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016. Unfortunately, it was a sad anniversary because that was about the same time they had to lay off most of their employees, and they shut down the large-scale mining operations that were taking place here, leaving just the small operation in Mine 7 to produce a little bit of coal for the power plant here in town and to sell on a limited basis to folks elsewhere in Europe. When I first came here about 10 years ago, about 40% of the workforce was doing mining-related jobs. And tourism back then was about 15% of the employment. Nowadays, mining-related jobs account for less than 10% of the workforce, while tourism has gotten to about 40, possibly above 40 by now, due to the changes in the recent years. And when you have that kind of turnover in just a few years, it also brings with it very, very drastic changes in the society. What we lost was a lot of people who for decades were working in the mine. Some lived here in town, some would come up for 2 weeks and then go back down to the mainland for 2 weeks. And instead of those people, we now have a large and growing number of tourism workers and students. The foreign population is also rising, and they're in shorter term jobs that don't necessarily pay as much or have as much stability. There's in fact a great deal of concern among the guiding community about the lack of stability and the lack of year-round employment. And so in addition to housing, in addition to climate change, avalanche worries, effects on environment, societal change is also a very big issue here, making a lot of news these days. And over to my right here, behind me, is the power plant I was mentioning that burns that coal. It's the only still operating coal power plant in Norway. And another issue of discussion on news these days is what is going to be Longyearby's long-term power source, because this plant perhaps has about 10 years of life in it, and there's perhaps 10 to 15 years of coal left here to be mined. So there's now an ongoing discussion that started at a greater level than before about the future. The government has outlined some preliminary findings that suggest that natural gas is the preferred alternative, but they've talked about other things as well, everything from solar and wind energy to even running a giant extension cable up here from the mainland, something a little similar to a giant telecommunications cable that runs under the ocean up here and provides us with some of the fastest internet in the world, which surprises a lot of folks when they come up here. But because of the volume of science research that happens up here, because of facilities such as Falstaff, which supplies a large percentage of the world with its climate data, those telecommunications are necessary, and it's what helps make Longyearbyen a much more modern, educated and affluent town than a typical Arctic town. The other element of that is that unlike a lot of Arctic towns, everybody who comes here is from somewhere else, and that means they're here for a reason, and they want to be here, and they have some very specific things they want to do, whether it's to earn a decent amount of money at a well-paying job, although not so much anymore, or just a sense of adventure, or to study something like climate change in a way you can't do anywhere else in the world. That's what makes this town so appealing to so many people, and while you definitely have to be a special kind of person to live here, I think, it's also a very special place, and that's what's kept me here all this time and has me wanting to remain here as long as possible, because every year has been more interesting to me in a news sense than the year before it, and I think that's a trend that's going to continue for decades as we witness the magnitude of change that's occurring here. This is the world's northernmost sundial, and as with so many things here in town, of course, it's got a polar bear as part of the device. And while the great thing about being here this time of year is it can tell you the time 24 hours a day, thanks to our 4 months of continuous sunlight during the summer, unfortunately today we have no clue what time it is because of all the clouds. So anyhow, below at the bottom of the hill here is a lodge called Marianne's Polar Rig, and it's run by a woman who's been here 20 or so years, who is one of many characters we have here in town, and probably the most infamous part of that lodge is her bar, which is called the Penis Pub. And the reason for that is because the penis bones of a number of large local animals, including a polar bear, reindeer, walrus, and so on, they're all in there on display, and she uses them as swizzle sticks with drinks. Now, she does it only with the guest's permission, of course, but if you want that option, it is available. Now, go out and look past it and past the university. Out in the channel there is one of the best bird watching sites in Longyearbyen early during the summer. And the reason for that is because, believe it or not, we do not treat our sewage here. We just discharge it out into the middle of the channel. So that is where all these birds will gather for that particular form of nourishment. Coming back closer, we have over here a memorial, which is for the people who fought and died during World War II. This is where usually hundreds of people from around town gather and end up on Norwegian Constitution Day, May 17th. They do a traditional procession through the streets of town with bands and other groups. And then they come here, and we have both Norwegian and Russian leaders meet at the memorial. They'll give speeches and lay flowers. And the reason for that is both Longyearbyen and Barentsburg suffered an immense amount of damage during World War II. They essentially evacuated the island, but in the end, Norway and Russia did fight as allies during that. And nowadays, there's a great deal of tension between Norway and Russia when it comes to Svalbard. Russia has been accused of trying to increase its authority here and challenging certain aspects of the Svalbard Treaty that it feels Norway is being too controlling on. And there have been a number of skirmishes, including the rights of certain Russians to visit here and some of the activities they conduct. But while that is going on at the national level, locally, there's a great deal of cooperation, both out of necessity and just out of the fact that, in the end, people who live here are more Svalbardians, I guess you could say, than separate country people. I mean, you got to remember, people from more than 50 countries live here, and so there's almost there's a presumption, I think, of acceptance among pretty much everyone who is here. And the interesting is the largest group of non-Russian foreigners here are Thai folks. There's about 130 of them, and that just built up by word of mouth, and they just started coming up here and doing service and other jobs. But we also have a very, very rapidly growing Filipino community. There's now about 60 or 70 of them, and that's, I believe, doubled in the past few years. So this area has a lot of allure to people who you might not think would move here. And again, the reason for that is there's just a lot of different types of adventure you can seek out. As you can see, the road behind me is closed, and the reason for that is because they're having to completely replace a bridge there that suffered damage due to flood water and other problems. And there's actually two places in town where that's happened. They had to close the road further up past the church here because that's facing a lot of damage from landslides and other natural elements. Again, all of this is in some way related to climate change and some of the more extreme and unusual weather and climate patterns that didn't exist before. So anyhow, over here is Svalbard Church, and it for a long time was open 24 hours a day, but now during the summer sometimes they will close it down because there was a problem with some people trying to sleep there and all that, and that obviously wasn't real kosher. And it's right now the priest who is departing actually very soon, early this fall. He is extremely active in climate change and other issues. And up there at that mining trestle above his church, back in the summer of 2015, he conducted a climate mass, and it was the first in a series of activities going from the northern part of Norway to the south to raise awareness for the Paris Climate Summit happening in December of that year. Now, in addition, however, to praying for achieving goals of of responsible behavior and awareness at this summit. He also offered a prayer for the continuing health of the coal mining company, Stora Norsk, and its workforce, hoping that they would keep their jobs and the mines stay open. I, of course, had to point out that this is a real rather hypocritical stance to take, given that you're calling for responsible climate action. And he said essentially, well, yeah, but it's really, really important for us and doesn't have that big an impact. But of course, that's the whole thing. They're asking for everybody to sacrifice a little. Norway, in fact, had the same bit of hypocrisy because they got rid of most of their investments in its oil wealth fund that had anything to do with coal, but they continued to pump in money to Stora Norsk in the form of loans and other assistance to try to keep it alive despite operating at a loss. They tried that for a couple of years and finally just gave up and decided it wasn't going to work out. But those are some of the attitudes that can be seen here. This is one of the world's most pristine places, yet we burn coal and we discharge raw sewage, and we have all those snowmobiles emitting emissions. Now, one thing we are seeing is a lot more talk of environmental responsibility from some of the newer residents who move up here. We had a green party start a few years back. We had somebody start a greenhouse up very far in the valley and is trying to focus on a sustainable food and farming program. So a lot of that is starting to pop up now. And that is why you also see efforts such as those more environmentally responsible tourism efforts I talked about earlier. A lot of the new companies that have started up are focusing on ecotourism and those activities, whether it's photography, other low impact diversions. So now we will start to walk back towards town, and what we're going to be doing is walking past some of the most coveted real estate at the moment in Longyearbyen, because as you can see, the homes at the edge of the mountains, they're very exposed if there's another avalanche. So all this area right here in this valley, this is going to be where things are built out. All these houses you see in the valley, they weren't here when I got here 10 years ago, but they've been built in the past several years, and everything is going to get filled in. So in 10 years, this will again look drastically different than it does now. Okay, so as we start getting back to the center of town, over there, I want you to take a note of that red and white building. Used to be a barn, then it was where Svalbard Museum was until it moved. And it's also the site of perhaps the most ridiculous car accident ever in Svalbard. It turns out that in the winter of 2011, somebody stole a car that had its engine running from the parking lot of Huset, where every weekend they have DJ parties that run way into the wee hours of the morning. And this guy took the car from there and went down this road at a very, very high rate of speed, and there was a lot of snow and ice on the road that day, and he ended up sliding off the road right where that old barn was, and ending up landing on the roof upside down with his vehicle. And that was not only the strangest incident of car theft I've ever seen here, it's also a very rare example of a car theft here, and there's a fairly obvious reason for that. If you steal a car here, where are you going to take it? I mean, there's nowhere to go other than the few kilometers of roads we have. So we did have some incidents during the past year, but mostly they were of the joyriding type, where you just take it for a bit of a spin and then drop it off somewhere. We generally are perceived as having very low crime here in town, and for the most part that's true. I've left a computer on a table at a cafe for a bit while I've been working, and I come back and it's still there. There's not a lot of theft, for example, except as I mentioned, we've had that problem with cruise ship tourists in recent years. But We do have some things that happen. We have some bar incidents that occur, some vandalisms. Unfortunately, we also have had some graffiti in recent years. It all kind of started when some guy came up here and got caught tagging a bunch of old structures with German football logos. And the sad part was is they couldn't clean that off because it would do more damage to the old structures to try to remove it. And unfortunately also, that resulted in more graffiti being seen elsewhere in town. It's almost like the stuff breeds. And again, as what happened with that guy who walked to Ice Field Radio, they ended up not pressing any charges against the person they caught. They just felt it was too much trouble to bring him back from Germany. So.
Jeg bare var der et halvårs tid før det, da, sånn at jeg ikke liksom var merket.
Okay. And now we're back to roughly where we started, and I'm standing outside Svalbardbutikken, the world's northernmost supermarket. In fact, it's a bit of a one-stop for everything type of store, since they also sell appliances and crafts and other things. It's also a spot where I believe probably more polar bear pictures get taken here than anywhere, because the entryway is always filled with people who are taking selfies or just portraits of the bear they have there at the entrance. Now, right now it's the only major store here, although we do have a small Thai supermarket, which I highly recommend to folks interested in instant noodles or other easy foods that work well for campers and students in dorms. There is talk of bringing a different grocery chain up here, and they have the brilliant idea of locating it right in this parking lot, right in front of their competition. Of course, this store isn't too keen on the idea. There is talk of perhaps adding it to this shopping center here, which is undergoing a complete rehaul at the moment, to make it more modern, as is going on with much of the center of town. There's talk of doing a large amount of redevelopment here to make it more pedestrian friendly, to add more businesses along the lower part of the strip, which we walked along earlier. And that's all part of a new master plan the city's looking at that will keep it going for the next 20 or 30 years. And so if you keep coming back here, you will keep seeing more and more changes in how this town looks, as well as how it feels on warm and cold days, and how the people you interact with are. Those will change as well. And anyhow, this is the end of the tour, and I greatly appreciate your doing this, and it's also where I pass the hat. This being a video tour, I'll do so virtually, and ask that you please help keep the newspaper that I publish here alive, and the chance to offer more of these tours to people alive. We haven't seen or talked about everything in Longyearbyen, of course. There's so much more, and there will continue to be more. Always developing. And again, I hope I can be here as long as possible to share those happenings with all of you. Thanks again.